really put a focus on housing. And let me tell you, I think, a really powerful symbol of where Washington has lost sight of how to think about housing, and it goes directly to your question about public housing. There is no housing committee in the United States Senate or the United States House. There is in the Assembly and the Senate and the legislature, but there's not in Congress. It is a subcommittee of banking. And that tells you how we have been thinking about housing, which is that it's something to kind of grease the wheels of Wall Street and our economy. It's something to make sure that we don't fall into a recession. And these things, many of us have lived through this. I came to California during this period and helped fight to keep people from losing their houses to foreclosure. But housing is so much more. And we have seen the private market will build some kinds of housing and not others. They need to have federal backstop and federal investment. And when I say investment, I mean money, but I mean more than that. I mean a partnership. I mean better data. I mean better imagination about what housing in this country could look like. The public housing that we built 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, we know created as many problems as it solved. But that doesn't mean you can't go back to the drawing board and rethink and use the best data that you can. California's problem is we have virtually no public housing. And so our problem is when we talk about funding public housing, all of that money will go to rehab existing public housing on the East Coast, not to building new public housing in California and on the West Coast and Colorado and other places that are growing. So I've been thinking a lot about how we can have the federal government backstop and create the private market incentives to build the housing that they will never build if they're not there. And let me give you an example. 30-year mortgage only exists because the federal government backstops it. The only bank I know that will make a 30-year fixed rate loan is Silicon Valley Bank. And look how that worked out, right? So the 30-year mortgage, everybody who has a 30-year mortgage, that's because the federal government's backstopping it. There are things we could do for housing that are in between the 30-year mortgage, which is out of reach for most people in California who do not currently own homes. Not some, most. That is one of the biggest political divides we have, is between homeowners and non-homeowners, even though we don't often think about it or talk about it that way. That 30-year mortgage, and then the 1-year lease with no protection, no stability, no connection to your community, no ability to have financial security. There are things you could have in between there. So think about a 4-year lease for college students so they could lock in housing security and price at the time they start going to college. Think about housing for seniors. That was a long-term lease to the end of their life that adjusted upward in relationship to the cost of living adjustment in Social Security. These are things the private market won't do unless we backstop them, but we need to fill in this gap. So do I think public housing is part of the solution? Yes. Do I think we're going to solve the entire problem with public housing? I don't. We are in a situation where we need a sort of all of the above approach to housing, but what we need most of all at the federal level is a leader on this. Somebody who sees housing as the number one challenge, because it is. It is the number one challenge when you talk to Californians. My own son, who's 15, asked me if I would visit him if he didn't live in California when he grew up. And I said, Paul, like, you love California. This is my kid who wants to work in movies. Like, why would you ever leave California? And he said, well, I think I might want to have a house, and I know I can't have one here. That's where we are. And that's the question that parents and business owners are hearing and confronting over and over again. So I think the answer is public investment in housing, whether that is straight up traditional public housing or kind of a range of different things. We need to get going. And what I hear federal leaders right now doing are two things. One is talking only about chronic street homelessness. That is a terrible, painful, both morally, it's an expensive, it's a terrible problem. But it is the tip of an iceberg. Street homelessness didn't come out of nowhere. It's not a fad. It is directly related to the cost of housing and people working full-time, even 2 jobs, unable to keep a roof over their head. We're not going to solve homelessness without changing the housing market, fundamentally. And then the second thing is I hear federal leaders who say, thank you for your question on housing. That's really a state issue. And then you hear the state leader who explains to you that it's a county issue, and then you hear the county leader who explains to you that it's a city issue, and then the answer is, are we going to build, ADUs and like garage apartments in backyards? Well, I think the answer should be yes. We are not going to solve a 50-year failure to invest in housing, one garage conversion at a time, okay? That's not how we're gonna get there. So do I think those are a good tool? Yes. Do I think people should do it? Yes. That is not a substitute for federal leadership on housing, and as your next US Senator, that's what I'm gonna provide.